Welcome to topic 4, social media marketing strategy. Now, in this topic, we'll introduce a strategic planning process which guides the development of social media marketing strategies and digital strategies in particular. We'll cover everything from situation analysis all the way down to evaluation. The key learning objectives that we'll cover in this topic are: where does social media marketing planning fit in an organization's overall plan? This is really important actually because thankfully social media marketing and digital marketing more broadly is being accepted into organizational planning, and it's important to understand where that role is. What are the phases of social media marketing maturity? What are the steps in actually developing a strategic plan? How can organizational structure themselves to better support social? And what are the key components of organizational social media policy? Now, I know the last one sounds a little bit dry with policy, but it's fundamental. Like, honestly, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble if you don't have proper policy set up and proper governance processes set up, because essentially you expose yourself to both a crisis situation, particularly in a crisis situation, but also it's just bad customer service if you don't have proper policies in place to actually support what's going on in your organization. So, stages of social media maturity. As with many different industries, we've got a trial phase, a transition phase, and a strategic phase. These phases in social can be actually really short. But the trials phase is the first phase. So organizations will test out social platforms, but they don't really consider how social media can play a role in the overall marketing plan. You got the transition phase. Here social media activities still occur somewhat randomly or haphazardly, and let's be honest, a lot of small to medium enterprises out there are probably sitting in that transition phase. But hopefully, where we get to, and especially in this subject with you, but also for the organizations that you work for, is that you get to a strategic phase. So here, you start to utilize a formal process to plan social media marketing activities with clear objectives and metrics. So social media now is integrated, a key component of organizations' overall marketing plan. So you can go from trial to strategic pretty quickly, but what it often requires is someone internally driving it. So it's amazing how with all this technology out there, it still requires the human touch to move from dipping your toe in the water to kind of doing things to actually planning. Now, one of the key reasons this subject was set up, and one of the key reasons that CSU more broadly is focusing on digital marketing from a teaching perspective, is because there's a lack of strategic social media planners out there. A lot of people know how to use sites or a particular site well, and they know all the tricks and what buttons to press, but from a strategic perspective about embedding it into an organizational framework, it just doesn't happen. So that's the main point for this subject, is not only to get your skills up in particular sites, but to actually start to think strategically. So what are the steps in social media planning? You've probably recognized these in introduction to marketing subjects, and they're pretty much well established, and the reason that they're well established is because they kind of work well. So we've got to conduct a situation analysis. Now that will be your assessment task 2. It's important to understand what's going on, and then we move on to stating your objectives. You need a direction, and you need that direction to be clear. Then you pick your target audience, or what we call a buyer persona, and then you select out of all the 4 zones that we covered in topic 1, which ones are you going to play in, which ones are you going to operate in, and how you're going to operate it. Then you create your experience strategy, and essentially then you establish your tactics, and then you execute, and then you measure. Now, why is the last phase so important, the evaluation stage? Because it feeds directly back in to your objective stage. Because a lot of social campaigns are only short run. You might have a 3-year plan for your entire social, for your strategy, but it's often made up of lots of little campaigns, and it's important to continually feed that campaign data back into one, your overall marketing strategy, but also into your next set of digital strategies. So we'll look at situation analysis. So there are a whole lot of questions there, and I'm going to expect you to go and answer the vast majority of them in your first major assessment task. But some key questions we can look at is, how many likes we have. This is interesting, but it's more interesting to start thinking, what is our push and pull mix? Like, how much are we going out there looking for people? How much are we pushing the message on? Or how much are people coming to us and then we're pulling people in? So what types of media do we use? So that's really interesting. Are we focusing on text? Are we using video content? These questions are really, really important, because not only do you need to understand what you're using, but also, is it appropriate for your particular audience, and is it effective? So you might have the mix right. So you might say, okay, our target groups like video content, you're creating video content, but then you realize the video content's not effective. So then you've got to examine what part of that content isn't effective. So is there synergies between your socials and your website, which is really important, because some people still like to go to websites and review things and go into a bit more detail. It depends at what stage of the purchase life cycle that they're in, and it depends on what their major motivations are. So look at how we respond to comments. Do we respond to comments? What's our rating? All these questions are fundamental in providing a really good understanding of where we sit as a brand in social. So, and then you might want to look at your competitors and see how they're doing using the exact same questions, how they're doing. And this is also important, because if you've got a really close competitor, or you're entering a new market and you want to know what your competitors are doing, following this particular framework will be really, really helpful. Now, objectives and budgets. We can't have an unlimited budget. Well, some people can, but even the biggest spender in the world, Red Bull, has limits. So it's important to understand, you'll get that from your organization. Your managers will probably tell you, hey, you got X amount to spend on this, or the client wants to spend X amount on this. So your budgets are going to be pretty much set. But developing objectives is really, we can break it up using SMART objectives. So being specific, measurable, action orientated, realistic, and timeline. Now, without a timeline, the rest of them are a little bit here or there for me. So it's important to be specific. Make sure it aligns with your target group, but you need to really have a clear direction. The measurable is really important. Now, thankfully, in social and digital, we have a ton of metrics that we can follow. And it's really important to kind of embed one of those metrics into the measurable stage. And it needs to be action orientated. You need to be doing something. All right. So, and then, as I said, you need to be achievable. So that relates back to the budget. So, does it, is it achievable? Is it realistic in relation to the budget? And timeline. Now, time tells me when things are going to start and finish. So it's really important to kind of follow that through. So the top objectives marketers pursue increase exposure. So that's a kind of an awareness objective. Increase traffic. Obviously, their theory is if you get more traffic, you've got more chance of getting a sale. Develop local fans. So that's creating a community. Provide marketplace insights, so position yourself as an expert and not just as a someone who develops, organization-centric information. So it's about, again, being part of a community. Generating leads, so directly linked to sales. Improving search rankings, so SEO is really, really popular, search engine optimization. So you want, when people type search words into keywords into Google, you need to pop up in those if they're related. And obviously improve sales and reduce marketing expense. Now, a lot of people go into digital thinking it's cheaper. It still takes a lot of human hours to get content right. It still takes a lot of work developing that content, especially video content. You can't just film everything on your phone and expect that quality will resonate with people. Some industries require high quality resolution. You still got GoPro and stuff that is pretty good, but essentially they're the top marketing objectives. All right, so let's move on to target audiences, or buyer personas. So a buyer persona essentially tells me and the organization who you are targeting. I know that sounds quite obvious, but it essentially lets us know, or lets people know, and helps focus your thoughts on exactly who you plan on targeting. Now, In topic 2, we discussed demographics and geodemographics and psychographics. So they will come into play here. So the strategic planner must access what is meant to speak to the audience in the social media space. So it's really important to consider the type of language that they're interested in, where they go, what they do, what are their underlying motivations, what are their pain touch points, what are their, which touch points do they trust, what we want to know and what they want to know. So, and how can we make sure that we retain them? These are all very important fundamental questions that we really need to research thoroughly and take our times to answer, because it's not just we targeting women between 35 and 45 that live in Sydney. It's not always that's just not detailed enough for social, because when we start to develop content and where we place that content, if suddenly YouTube becomes a poo-poo sort of site and that no one wants to go there, they might have some massive data breach, and then suddenly it becomes a pain touch point, or it becomes really hard to use, or they make it overly complex. Posting videos on there might not be the way to go. You might create Instagram stories instead. So essentially the buyer persona, the deeper you get into that person, the better you understand that particular target group, the stronger you're going to set yourself up for success in the strategy component. So step 4, social media zones and vehicles. So here's an example of Honda. Again, we've got our 4 zones. So we really need to look at social, the community, the publishing, the gaming, and we really need to understand what are they doing in these areas. How are they playing in these areas? So it's really important to get your head around each one of those 4 areas and make notes on each one of those 4 areas in regards to your buyer persona, and then look at your brand and then audit your brand. What's your brand doing in all of these spaces? Now then you can start to see, is there a match? Is there a difference? Where's the difference? What do we need to do to close that gap? All right, experience strategy. Now the experience strategy is essentially the thinking part, the creating part, the matching part. So creative experience strategies incorporate message strategy. So the creative approach we'll use to throughout the campaign. So what's our key message? How's it going to communicate with the brand? A positioning statement. So how are we going to position our brand in relation to our competitors in the minds of the consumer? This is really important. You got the creative brief. So this is essentially it's a document that helps creative channels their energy towards sound solutions for the brand in question. So for social media campaigns, it might be called an experience brief or a propagation brief. And then you got the brand experience. So these are sensations, feelings, and thoughts and behaviors evoked by brand-related stimuli. So in the when the creatives talk about stimuli, so what responses are going to think, what thing is it going to trigger, what thing it's going to promote. So it's to trigger something, it's sensory dimension, it's to evoke an affective dimension, it's to activate a behavioral dimension, or is it to stimulate the like a cognitive dimension? Is it getting them to think more deeply about stuff? So it's important to reflect on some questions. It's important to really reflect on some questions. So what is the campaign goals and the communication task? How is the brand going to be positioned? And obviously, who is the target audience? So like, what are we trying to do? It's really, really important to get to the bottom of that. Is there another group of people who can persuade the target audience? So that's when we start to think about our influencers. What are the existing creative assets? And how can we integrate our other branded media with our social stuff? And then we can start asking off some really important questions like what type of content will be needed, how will we experience engagement to be extended and shared throughout the social campaign. So it's kind of it's all the questions that we really need to ask to really focus our attention on creating the perfect match between message, channel, execution, and motivation. And brand experience leverages our brand personality. Now, the thing that you don't want to do is in one area of your marketing campaign create a particular brand personality, and then in socials kind of contradict that. Now, they don't always have to be aligned because, personalities are multidimensional, but you don't want to contradict them too much, because that's when you can get into trouble, and essentially you start sending mixed messages out. Once we've put everything into practice in our activation plan, then we have to look at the execution and the measurement. So typically there are some major mistakes done, both in the execution and in the measurement phase. The number one is staffing. So what often is the problem is that there's not enough, you don't have enough staff, you don't have enough quality staff that know what they're talking about, and it's really important to ensure that you've got good quality staff supporting your actions. The next that normally fails is content. So normally either the content, there's not enough of it, it's not targeted enough, it's not of high enough quality, or it doesn't match the expectations of the consumer group. Now the other component where a lot of things fail is the time horizon. Often people try and either do things too quickly or too slowly, or they don't dedicate enough time to actually achieving the objective, or they just don't give enough time for people to find the brand. Like, there's so much content going on in social, sometimes it takes people a little bit of time to find who you are. Now, focus on objectives. Sometimes objectives are either too broad or overly narrow, or they don't really point the organization or the brand in a particular direction that it should be going in. So a lot of focus needs to go into getting your objectives right. And then obviously user benefits in the message relays, and does it work, and its functionality and all that sort of stuff. And then often people don't measure, so they'll run it and not learn whether it did well or didn't do well. Now, most social media sites, and if you're using social media software, like Hootsuite or whatever, all those measurements are already embedded. Now, they only tell you half a story. They only tell you really what's going on. And in topic 10, we'll go into measurement and analytics in a lot more detail. But essentially, it's always good to do complementary research, what we call qualitative research, where we actually try to examine why the figures are the way they are. And that's really important as well. So it's not just about were we successful or were we unsuccessful. It's also about exploring why that's the case. So the next section we'll discuss is managing social media marketing in the organization. So as I mentioned previously, establishing policy is absolutely fundamental. It essentially sets your standard of conduct. It helps with disclosure requirements and standards for posting intellectual property, financial information, copyright information. So there may be some sensitive data within the organization, and your employees and your staff really need to know what you can and what you can't post. So there's often some different structures. You've got everything from a centralized structure down to a dandelion structure. We'll go through those individually now. So a centralized structure is what typically people think of an organizational structure. The social media department functions as a senior level that reports to the chief marketing officer or directly to the CEO. The organic structure, the centralized structures tend to be adopted in centralized organizations, so they tend to kind of mimic the organizational structure. An organic structure, no one person owns the social media space like in the organization. Instead, all employees represent the brand and work in social media in their roles. So this structure works really well if you're aiming for engagement. The only downside to it is sometimes the messaging can be consistent. The messaging can be inconsistent. Then we've got the holistic honeycomb structure. So this is essentially where everybody is involved in it, but all focusing on the one social channels. Like they're not working independently, like as in the organic structure where people get to react and respond. They're all working under one umbrella. And then you've got the coordinated model. This is a team of people who are cross-functional, trained, and ready to address various types of social media needs. So this is a really good one if you've got, say, 8 or 9 really tight people that can kind of feed in different areas and work in different areas. And then you've got the dandelion structure. So essentially a multi-layered hub and spoke model. So this is where people have the people are directed, but then they have a level of autonomy within that to kind of react and work. So this is when you have teams within teams. And as I mentioned before, social media management systems are increasing in popularity. The last time I checked, there was about 50 of them. I've played around with a lot of them. There are advantages and disadvantages to them. So like you've got Buffer and you've got Hootsuite. There's free versions of those that, if you're a really small business and you're only going to focus on 3 channels, if LinkedIn, Facebook, and like Instagram, they're quite easy to manage. The functionality essentially varies depending on how much you pay. So as with many things, the more you pay, the more you get. But they do help to manage your day-to-day operations. So like you can plan all your content out in advance. You can put all your posts in. You can organize your hashtags. These are really good for campaigns and day-to-day postings because you can run them concurrently. And if you've got a 2-week campaign, you can set it all up beforehand and essentially then modify as needed. So it helps track content. It helps collect sentiment. It helps you plan and manage your social ads. You can start to assess the effectiveness and you can monitor. And as I said, you can essentially listen, so through sentiment. And then importantly, you can capture all that data and you can put it into a report and it'll help inform the next campaign that you do. So social media management systems, I've been using them now for about 7 years and I think they're completely invaluable. I love them. As I said, you've got the high-end ones like Sprinklr, for example, who cost they cost like $25,000 a year to buy the license for. But what they do, like if you're a large organization, they're completely phenomenal. Like they're absolutely amazing. They do automated sentiment analysis, so each day you can see how people are talking about you, what they're discussing. You can extract user-generated content straight off them and use them as your post. It makes the whole thing completely streamlined, and essentially, like for I know $25,000 a year sounds expensive. You can get stuff for $1,000 a year, but the top end one it actually does the work for about 2 people. So while it seems very expensive at $25,000 or $30,000 a year, you're actually saving that in wages because you can streamline your activity so much. And finally, for topic 4, we'll look at a framework for strategic social media marketing. So it's important, as we can see on the left-hand side, you get your goals, you understand your culture, you understand your resources. So this is all from a cultural, from the organizational perspective. Then you've got to understand your stakeholders, the networks that they work in, the scope, the level of governance, the structure. All these things come to play a part even before you start developing any content. They really do help you understand what your capabilities are, what you can and can't do, and importantly, they give your staff guidance in regards to what's internally acceptable, the particular voice that you want to have, the level of flexibility in how people can respond, what are the processes in responding, and what are the processes in posting. All these things play a really large role in how well you will do in social media, and there's no one model that's better than another. But you just need to understand that there are limitations to some of these models. All right, thank you very much, and we'll move on to topic 5.